Hello there, welcome to the program. I'm Joke Rogers here in Lagos. We begin in Ukraine, which says its air force shot down 13 explosive drones launched overnight from southern Russia after air raid sirens sounded for hours in Kyiv. According to the Air Force, Russian forces had launched 15 Iran-made drones from the Bryansk region north of Kyiv, 13 of which Ukrainian forces shot down. Russia has been launching missile and drone attacks against Ukraine's critical infrastructure since October, spurring Kyiv to bolster its air defense systems with Western help. In Kyiv, air raid signals rang out for several hours early on Monday, and the authorities said air defenses were triggered by an aerial target. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says top military commanders have pledged to keep defending Bakhmut. He made this revelation at a meeting of top military officials when asked how he would deal with the situation of the besieged city. He then asked the commander of the regional grouping and Ukraine's commander-in-chief how troops proposed to proceed on the matter.
The matter of Bakhmut became the key one at this staff meeting. I directly asked General Syrsky and Zalunji, the commander-in-chief, how they see the further defensive operation in the Bakhmut direction, whether to withdraw or strengthen defense, and our positions in the city. Both generals responded not to withdraw, but strengthen. The staff unanimously supported this position. There were no other positions. I told the commander-in-chief to find the relevant forces to help our guys in Bakhmut. We defend and will defend every part of Ukraine. The time will come and we will liberate every city and village of our country. And we will hold the occupier accountable for every shot against Ukraine.
Сьогодні з'явилося відео, як окупанти по звірячому.
And speaking of Bakhmut, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu says the seizure of the eastern city of Bakhmut would allow Moscow's forces mount further offensive operations. Russia has been waging an intense campaign for months to seize control of the small city in what would become its first significant territorial advance since last summer. Mr. Shoigu also says the West was increasing its arms deliveries to Ukraine, but vowed they would not change the course of events in the battlefield. Ukraine's top generals have also vowed to keep defending the city. Meanwhile, the Kremlin says it did not recognize a price cap introduced by Western countries on its oil exports after the United States said that the cap was working well. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says the cap was introduced fairly loosely and it's working to not allow the system threaten Russia's interests. Washington was one of the key architects of the Russian oil price cap, which aims to drive down Moscow's earnings from crude and fuel exports. In the meantime, the Kremlin says it did not recognize the price cap introduced by Western countries on its oil exports. Well, staying with the Ukraine crisis, let's move on to other stories. A Bangkok-based geopolitical analyst, Berletic, alleges that the U.S. has been preparing to wage a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine for decades. Mr. Berletic said that the U.S. has been deploying military forces across the world to undermine regional peace and stability. He adds that the U.S. has been pushing the eastward expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for many years and has been preparing to launch a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine.
If you're being objective, it is impossible not to notice that is not what the U.S. military is doing. It is not protecting the U.S. And I saw it firsthand in Japan, a country that is supposed to be a U.S. ally. The United States is waging a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine. The United States government, who openly, publicly, repeatedly over many years protested against the construction of the Nord Stream pipeline. They tried to use sanctions. They put pressure even on their own allies, supposed allies in Germany, to stop this cooperation with Russia. And when it became clear that this was not going to happen, I believe they got desperate, and the ultimate expression of this desperation was just finally the physical destruction of the pipeline.
Well, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says there would be consequences if China sends weapons to Russia for Moscow's war in Ukraine, but he is pretty optimistic that Beijing will refrain from doing so. When asked by reporters if he could imagine sanctioning China for aiding Russia, Mr. Scholz replied, "I think it will have consequences, but we're now in a stage where we're making clear that this should not happen, and I'm relatively optimistic that we will be successful with our request in this case. But we'll have to keep looking at it, and we'll have to be very cautious." U.S. officials have warned recently that China was considering providing arms and ammunition to Moscow. Let's get you back to the situation in Russia and, of course, the crisis in Ukraine. We were talking earlier about the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who says there would be consequences if China sends weapons to Russia for Moscow's war in Ukraine, but he's pretty optimistic that Beijing will refrain from doing so. And when asked by reporters if he could imagine sanctioning China for aiding Russia, Mr. Scholz replied that it will have consequences, but there's now a stage where they're making clear that this should not happen, and he's relatively optimistic that Germany will be successful with requests on this case, but we'll have to look at it, and they have to be very, very cautious. Of course, there have been other news about the Russia, attacking Ukraine, and the latest being that it's trying to capture the city of Bakhmut, a very important city. Let's get more on that as we bring in the security expert David Otto, who joins us from our Abuja studio. Good to see you again, David, today.
Thank you for having me.
Right, so what do you make of, first, let me ask you about Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu's statement saying that capturing Bakhmut will allow Russian forces to advance further into Ukraine. How important is the city of Bakhmut to Russia?
I mean, it's quite important. You know that Russia has already declared this Donbas region as, part of the Donetsk People Republic. This Bakhmut especially is a very strategic location, very close to, not too far away from Kherson, but also from Kyiv in the north. So I believe on a military aspect, the Russians, after the winter, this is their first combat battle in an urban area. So it will be important for them to demonstrate to Ukraine, but also to its NATO allies, that it still has the manpower, despite there are talks of, this war being fought mainly by, what they call Wagner, militias, but more importantly, Russia has also deployed a lot of forces on ground to demonstrate that it still has the capacity and capabilities to keep fighting. So it's quite important for Russia to continuously, consolidate, the territories that it had declared, as part of Russia. But more importantly for Russia, I think the Donbas region, which is close to Bakhmut, as I mentioned earlier on, is a very strategic region of mineral resources, including coal. So if they do keep this region, and if the Ukrainians out of this area, then it's quite significant for its consolidation strategy, even though it talked about just a simple military operation. But, Russia wants to continuously maintain this region, and that will be quite key for it.
So Germany says that there would be consequences if China sends weapons to Russia for Moscow's war in Ukraine, but Germany also aided Ukraine with weapons and tanks. What are we seeing playing out here?
I think what some analysts have said, previously, is that, it is some level of double standards in terms of, Germany supporting, Ukraine with weapons, but then, in China not to do the same. I think the argument of Germany is that, Russia is the aggressor. They were the ones who invaded Ukraine. and therefore Ukraine is the victim and is the weaker party. Therefore, the Germans have the right to support Ukraine, but China doesn't have the right to do so. But for China, I think, the position of China has been very clear that, it does want to remain neutral. It does want to ensure that there is some kind of a negotiated settlement. But, I think some of these narratives, what they could do is to push China to the point where they could actually, if not already, support, Russia with the weapons that the West is afraid that, they would support, Russia with. But essentially, I think, there is no good guy, when it comes to the war in Ukraine. What we should be looking at, particularly even if you're talking from a German perspective, is to look for some kind of a solution to end the war after, it's been fought for over a year now, which was the 24th of February, which made it a year. So I think it's quite important that instead of escalating, the psychological warfare, which I think this is the case, or some kind of a narrative warfare, I think we should be focusing more on finding a lasting solution to the crisis.
You spoke of analysts. Some have said that the U.S. has been preparing to wage a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine for decades now. You are a security analyst. Do you think the U.S. is using Ukraine as a bait to get to Russia?
I think what everybody wants, since this war began, it has been very clear that, it should be some kind of a de-escalation. Russia has complained severally that this war is a proxy war. It is not fighting Ukraine only. It is also fighting NATO. It is also fighting the U.S. But it's very clear that it is fighting the U.S. It is fighting NATO because, of course, these nations are supplying. Before it was defensive weapons, now we can see much more offensive weapons. And there are also talks about mercenaries, coming from different Western countries and to fight in Ukraine as volunteers. So I think it's quite critical that all this proxy war becomes addressed, because of course, the world is no longer a unipolar system. I think, Russia has demonstrated that it will not sit and fold its arms, while its territory is being threatened. Now, however you see that, I think the Russians have the right to defend what they see as an existential threat, and that is the case which Russia mentioned, that the expansion of NATO towards Ukraine, or if Ukraine were to become a member of NATO, then it will threaten the borders, would threaten Russia's national security, but also be an affront to the Minsk agreement. So I think, more importantly, I don't disagree with people that say this is a proxy war. I don't disagree with people that say, NATO is expanding. But I also don't disagree with people that say, Russia's aggression should have been resolved in another way. I think the final way forward to this is for both countries or all the parties to the conflict, to come together to some kind of a negotiated settlement. An escalation to this conflict is not good for Russia, it is not good for Ukraine, and it is not good for NATO and our allies or the world in general.
Thanks again, David, for your time today on the show.
Thank you for having me.